Welcome, Solicitor General Kagan. We've heard a lot today about your work experience, as we should. But when I think about your broad range of legal work and the practical real-world experience you've had, I'm reminded of the famous speech that President Teddy Roosevelt gave 100 years ago this year. To paraphrase President Roosevelt, it's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the one who is actually in the arena, who strives to do the deeds, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and whose place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Solicitor General Kagan, there are always a lot of critics on the sidelines, but you have actually been in the arena as a manager, as a teacher, as an advisor, as a consensus builder, and as a lawyer. In every job you've had, you've worked very hard and you've done very well. That is why you are before us today being considered, in the words of Teddy Roosevelt, for this high achievement. Your work on the front lines tells me that you have practical experience thinking about the impact of laws and policies on the lives of ordinary Americans. When you're involved in considering the nitty-gritty details of different policies, when you're actually in the game as a decision maker, you have to figure out when to compromise and when to hold firm. You have to know exactly what the consequences of your recommendations will be. You have to think about the lives that will be impacted. You were the first woman dean of Harvard Law School. There you were widely credited with bringing together a faculty that was rife with division. Whether you were helping recruit talented professors to Harvard from across the political spectrum, as noted by Senator Graham, or later when you were working with senators from both parties on anti-tobacco legislation, you forged coalitions and found resolution between seemingly intractable parties. It strikes me that it takes a pretty extraordinary person who, after working in the Clinton administration, can still get a standing ovation from the Conservative Federalist Society, who inspires a group of 600 law students to show up for a rally wearing I Love Elena t-shirts, who is widely credited with calming the factionalism that had previously roiled your law school. In several different jobs now, you have successfully managed lawyers, and worse yet, law professors, a group that can certainly be described as fearless in the face of supervision. In sum, you've had a lot of practical experience reaching out to people who have very different beliefs, and that's increasingly important on a very divided Supreme Court. That must be, by the way, why you have all the previous Solicitor General from the past 25 years under both Democratic and Republican administrations supporting you for this job. You also spent years teaching students as a law professor. You understand how law school allows students to dig deep into the details of a case and see the shades of gray. I think those of us in Congress could do well to recall the spirit of law school more frequently, to remember a time when it was our job to think through both sides of an argument and to give credence to the legitimate points of the other side. I believe that in government today, people need to engage rather than retreat to the opposite sides of the boxing ring. This brings me to a story about my fellow Minnesotan Justice Harry Blackmun. His oldest daughter gave him a copy of Scott Turow's classic book 1L for his 70th birthday. As you know, it's a book about the first year of law school. After reading the book, Justice Blackmun wrote a note to Scott Turow. He wrote, "Surely there is a way to teach law, strict and demanding though it may be, with some glimpse of its humaneness and basic good. You so properly point out that there is room for flexibility in different answers, and that not all is black or white. If I ever learned anything on the bench," Justice Blackmun said, "it is that." It seems to me, General Kagan, that in all the jobs you've had, you have carried this spirit of law school with you, the spirit of constant engagement and good faith efforts to reconcile different views. We would welcome such traits on our Supreme Court. I also see in you someone like your former boss, Thurgood Marshall, someone who thinks that the law is more than just an academic exercise. I, for one, would like to see someone who thinks very deeply about the consequences that legal choices and legal decisions have on real people. For me, I would welcome a justice who, in the Lilly Ledbetter employment discrimination case, would raise, like Justice Ginsburg did, some real-world points like, what was Lilly supposed to do to file her complaint on time? Run around and ask male employees what their salaries were, sneak into their desks to see their paychecks. I would also welcome a justice who, in the Exxon Valdez case, as pointed out by my colleague Senator Whitehouse, would have thought, as Justice Stevens did, about the real-world impacts of slashing the damages that the jury had awarded to the 32,000 fishermen whose livelihoods were tragically impacted by the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. While I do not know what you would have done in these cases, your practical experience leads me to believe you may have at least considered such things. Now, even with the variety of legal experiences that you have had, questions have been raised as to whether it is appropriate to nominate someone to the Supreme Court who has never been a judge before. As you know, more than 1/3 of all Supreme Court justices throughout history didn't have prior judicial experience, including Justices Rehnquist and Frankfurter and Brandeis. In an acknowledgement of the importance of your real-world experience, Justice Scalia said recently that he was, quote, happy to see this latest nominee is not a federal judge and not a judge at all. I think your practical experience will be helpful should you be confirmed to the Supreme Court, and I look forward to asking you more about that. As a former prosecutor, I'm particularly interested in your approach to criminal law cases. When I was a Hennepin County attorney, I saw firsthand how the law can impact the lives of real people. Of course, criminal justice cases that reach the Supreme Court involve complicated trade-offs between competing values, safety, privacy, and liberty. And I'd like to know more about how you expect to evaluate these issues. I often get concerned that pragmatic experiences are missing in judicial decision-making, such as when I looked at last year's Supreme Court decision in the Melendez-Diaz case, where a majority broadly interpreted the Confrontation Clause to include crime lab workers, creating potentially unwieldy and unnecessary requirements for prosecutors. I want to ask you about that. As I consider your nomination, I also want to reflect on how far we've come. Senator Feingold mentioned the obstacles that Sandra Day O'Connor and that Justice Ginsburg faced when they were coming up through the legal ranks. And I know you're well aware of the strides that women have made. In a 2005 speech quoting Justice Ginsburg, you described a 1911 student resolution at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. This resolution would have introduced a 25-cent per week penalty on all students without mustaches. The women who came before you to be considered by this committee helped blaze a trail. And although your record stands on its own, you are also, to borrow a line from Isaac Newton, standing on the shoulders of giants. In the course of more than 2 centuries, 111 justices have served on the Supreme Court. Only 3 have been women. If you are confirmed, you would be the 4th, and for the first time in its history, 3 women would take their places on the bench when arguments are heard in the fall. Last year, at the confirmation hearings for Justice Sotomayor, I said I was looking for 3 things in a Supreme Court justice: good judgment, humility, and the ability to apply the law without fear or favor. I'd like to add 1 additional considerations to the 3 standards I mentioned last year. I'd like to see a Supreme Court justice who is able to go into the back room where the justices meet and where no ordinary citizens are present and bring some real-world perspective to the room. I'd like to see someone who wouldn't expect the victim in an employment discrimination case to go rifling through her male coworker's desk to see what their pay stubs say. I'd like to see someone who wouldn't expect prosecutors to bring a crime lab analyst to every trial, even when the crime lab's findings aren't disputed. This will be my focus at the hearing. I'm hopeful that your background and experiences, to use the words of Teddy Roosevelt, the experiences of someone who has actually been in the arena, will help you be that person. I am hopeful that you will use your great skills and abilities to bring that common sense perspective to the court. And remember that the cases that you hear involve real people with real problems looking for real remedies. Thank you very much.